Let's go ahead and get into the Word. Last week, we have had the Apostle Paul. He was continuing to focus on his theme of God desiring to bring about restoration, reconciliation, and unity in our world. And first of all, the Apostle Paul made clear in the beginning part of the book of Ephesians, as we're walking through that book, he made it very clear that, listen, first of all, before reconciliation, restoration, and unity can take place in our world, it has to take place in our hearts. It has to begin in our hearts and in our lives that we have a right relationship with God and we're seeking to be obedient to Him and what it is that He is calling us to do. And then as a result of the reconciliation and restoration and unity that God is working in our hearts and our relationship with Him, that then translates out into the world around us, because ultimately God then pushes us out because of the love of God that is existing in us in order to reach the lost and dying world. Those that are living in sin and those that are living in darkness, seeking wholeness and satisfaction, we have the answer for them. We have the hope for them. And that hope is Jesus Christ. See, they were made to walk in a relationship with God through Jesus Christ. It was what we were created for, but sin sort of disrupted all that. That fellowship with God was broken because of sin, and now we live in a world in which people seek satisfaction in the things of the world, but they keep coming up empty time and time again. They seek for satisfaction and power and money and relationships and drugs and drink and food and whatever materialistic thing. They seek wholeness and satisfaction, and yet the morning comes and they wake up and they are just left with the after effects of having all of that stuff, but they're still hungry. There's still the void that's in their soul. So the Apostle Paul has really been focusing in on that particular area. And so last week what we talked about is, first and foremost, the first area of ministry, the first line of defense for the Christian, for those that proclaim themselves to be Christ followers. The first area we begin to influence for reconciliation, restoration, and unity of our world is in our homes. And it begins in a husband and wife relationships. It begins in having the right relationship between the man and the woman, and the fact that the man is leading out and showing what sacrificial love looks like. Thus, he is displaying the love that Christ showed for us. The Apostle Paul is continuing on this track as we get down into these next couple of verses in chapter 6 and verses 1 through 4. But this time he has a different audience in which he is targeting. He is targeting children and their parents, and specifically he's targeting children and their fathers. Why is that? Because the Apostle Paul knows that long-term change and gospel change and transformation in our world is most effectively going to be passed through generational lines. He understands that a father that is teaching and leading well in what it is that Christ has called him to do is ultimately going to lead well in such a way that his children begin to model that behavior. They begin to live that out. They begin to expect that from their spouses also. And so faithful obedience, the Apostle Paul is teaching faithful obedience in the same direction. So this week, if you are physically able, will you please stand for the reading of God's holy, inspired, infallible, and inerrant word from Ephesians chapter 6, beginning in verse 1, and I'll go all the way down to verse number 4. Ephesians chapter 6, beginning in verse number 1. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, because this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you and that you may have a long life in the land. Fathers, don't stir up anger in your children, but bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. Heavenly Father, I want to thank you. I want to thank you that we can praise your great name. Father, we proclaim and we are excited about what it is that you have to say to us this morning. May you, Father, bless the reading and the proclamation of your word. And may I preach as though never to preach again, and as a dying man to dying men. Amen. You may be seated. I had a friend of mine once. I had the opportunity to ask him a question after he had served several tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan. and he was a part of the elite Army Rangers. And I asked him what would his long-term approach be to toppling a small government or regime, and he's not allowed to use deadly force. Without hesitation whatsoever, he answered quickly. He said, I would change the minds of the younger generation. I would aim to change the minds of the younger generation. Because if you can change the minds of the younger generation, then change will eventually occur, because statistically speaking, inevitably speaking, the younger generation always outlives the older generation. See, as a result of this reality, I asked him this question because I knew what he was going to answer with. I knew that ultimately, in order to bring about true and lasting change in our world, we really need to begin educating and influencing and discipling our children and teaching them what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ. As a result of this reality, we have a responsibility to not only take care of us and our relationship with God, but we have the responsibility to prepare those that are coming after us, those that will be here longer than we will remain here. We must prepare them in order to do the work of spreading the good news of the gospel out into the world around them. That preparation, ultimately, it begins in the home. As Paul opens up the scripture, I want you to notice something that's interesting. He says, children, obey your parents in the Lord. Notice one of two things. One, the Apostle Paul is addressing children in this letter. Now, the Apostle Paul isn't reading the letter to the people. He is writing the letter to the churches that are located in Ephesus. And so he is writing this letter to them, and he is expecting this letter is going to be proclaimed at one of their gatherings together. And so with that understanding, the Apostle Paul directly addresses children in this letter. Why is that? Because he assumes that children are going to be present when the letter is read. He assumes that, listen, there are parents that are seeking to be faithful disciples of Christ, faithful followers of Christ, and as a result of that, they are going to bring their children and teach their children what it means to follow after Him. So they're going to be there to listen to what it is that the apostle has to say. So one, he addresses children in the letters. And if children were present, then it's obvious that it's likely their parents had brought them to hear what the Apostle Paul had to say. Now, we're going to come back to those in just a minute. Look at the verse again. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, because this is right. This word here, obey the parents, it ultimately is being modified by the statement in the Lord. The Apostle Paul is seeking to convey the point to the children that are present. Listen, as a result of you being a Christ follower, the fundamental expectation as a Christ follower is that you would be in obedience to your parents. If you were to proclaim to be someone who follows after Christ, then the first expected outworking of your obedience is going to be submission to God, and that submission to God then results as obedience and submission to the parents or the guardians who have been given parental responsibility over you. Your obedience to your parents, children, no matter your age, it doesn't matter if you're 4 years old or 2 years old or you're 40 years old or 45 years old, your obedience and honor to your parents is your initial means of modeling your obedience to God. One of the things that we frequently remind our children of is that God gave our children to us as a gift. Those children are a gift to us. He's entrusted them to us, and we, as their parents, are entrusted with them in order to love them, to care for them, to look out for them, to teach them in such a way that they too will love and follow the Lord. And as their parents, God has granted us authority over their lives. Now that authority comes from God ultimately, but He has entrusted us with that authority. And since that is the case, when our children are disobedient towards our requests or our expectations or our rules, then they are fundamentally being disobedient to the authority that God has placed over them, and so they are being disobedient to God. Which is why the Apostle Paul says, obey your parents, for this is right. But he doesn't stop there. He goes on. He says, honor your father and mother so that it may go well with you and you may have a long life. Honor your father and mother so that it may go well with you and you may have a long life. Now, this is one that I remember being quoted whenever I was a kid growing up. As I was headed out the door, my mom's personal translation was slightly different. It was, Chris, you better listen to me or you're going to die. I don't think the Apostle Paul was speaking specifically in those terms. If you don't listen, Paul's not saying, listen, if you don't listen, you're going to get whacked. That's not God's not sitting up there and saying, well, I'm going to send a car your way just because you're not obedient to your parents. But Paul's point was that a child who honors his parents at any age can expect two blessings to occur. One, that it will be well with him or her, and that he will have a long life on the earth. Now, this does not mean that everyone that dies young has dishonored their parents. Paul is ultimately, he's stating a principle that when you listen and obey your parents in the Lord, you'll have a you will avoid a great deal of danger and thus avoid things that could threaten or shorten your life. Quick question. How many of you in this room would have had a lot less headaches in your life if you would have just listened to mom or dad? Right? This is the Apostle Paul. He's trying to teach you. Listen, you can go about learning and doing life one of two ways. You can fall on your face on your own, or you can watch somebody else fall on their face and learn from it. I prefer to watch the other. Or it's one of those elements of someone's giving you wisdom, saying, hey, don't do this. I've made these mistakes. I can guide you in these things. I can tell you that this is a temptation that I faced, or these are difficulties that I face. And so there's wisdom that is seeking to be conveyed there. And the Apostle Paul is saying, listen to the wisdom in which God has given you in the form of your parents. But the Apostle Paul doesn't end there. He has one more thing to address, or should I say more specifically, he has one more person to address. Look there in verse number 4. Fathers, don't stir up anger in your children, but bring them up in the training and the instruction of the Lord. Smart man once made the statement, before I got married, I had 5 theories about bringing up children. Now I have 5 children and no theories. Funny as that is, as parents, we have a responsibility to God. We have a responsibility to God to raise our children in such a way that it is pleasing and acceptable toward those whom He has entrusted to us. Maybe you're saying here today, well, my kids are all grown up. Well, you have the opportunity to influence your grandchildren or your great-grandchildren. We were instructed, we were given this responsibility to God to raise our children in such a way that is pleasing and acceptable toward those whom He has entrusted. This verse highlights a few of those responsibilities. Look there in verse number 1. Verse number 4. Don't stir up anger. Don't stir up anger. In the book of Colossians, the Apostle Paul really parses this out. He expands his thoughts. He says, don't stir up anger lest they be discouraged. His point was that he didn't want the parent, specifically the father, because the mother, traditionally speaking, is going to be a little bit more compassionate and patient, while as fathers, we are a get it done now and get it done quick sort of mentality. But the Apostle Paul, he didn't want the parent, the parental figure, to use their authority to abuse the child, but rather encourage them and build them up. This discouragement that the Apostle Paul is talking about here is probably better defined in another phrase. He's saying, listen, don't anger your children, and namely, don't break their spirit. Don't break their spirit. A broken spirit can happen in a child in several ways. Maybe that child only receives criticism and is never encouraged. They only get a backbiting word or a biting word, but they never get the encouragement that they need. They're hardly, if ever, praised. Maybe the parents are consistently being inconsistent and unfair in the discipline. Listen, just because a child spills their milk, that doesn't raise any need for there to be a stream of obscenities or frustrations that are then expressed in that child in their adolescence there. Maybe a child can have a broken spirit because they never receive the affection that they long for, that they desire. How do you provide that type of love? Well, the Apostle Paul continues. He says, don't stir up anger, but bring them up. That is to say, nurture them. And nurturing isn't just providing food and shelter and clothing. Nurturing means caring for them emotionally and caring for them spiritually. There's a lot of men that may say, especially if you're one of the older generations and maybe your father was a little bit harder, you have the mentality of saying, well, my daddy never hugged me. He never told me that he loved me, and I survived. Yeah, you don't sound bitter about that at all. Stop punishing your child or your grandchildren or your great-grandchildren because somebody didn't do something for you that they should have. The God the Father, He cares for us. He cared for us and us to sacrifice, and He says, I love you. God loved the world so much that He gave His only begotten Son. He conveyed that love. And if we're to be modeling Christ in our homes, then it would make logical sense that we would express our love for our family verbally and show it from a physical aspect. But Pastor, I don't know how to do that. You do it just by putting your arm around and saying, hey, I love you. Being consistent with them. Spending time with them in something they want to do, in something they enjoy doing. Engaging with them where they're at and saying, I care about you, so I'm coming to where you are. As a parent, it is your chief responsibility to train your child in the ways of the Lord. But Pastor, isn't that your job? Isn't it your responsibility to teach my children about God? Isn't that why we need a youth pastor? Isn't that why we have Sunday school teachers? Because they're equipped, they're trained to be able to talk to my kids and tell them about the things of the Lord. If they have a question, I'm going to bring them to you. Well, let me ask you a question. Who has a greater opportunity for impact on your child? Me or you? The reality is that most, your child, if they're here on Sunday morning, every Sunday morning, for an entire year, they're here at most 120 hours a week, 120 hours a year. That's not a whole lot. But how many hours are they with you? How many hours do you spend with them that you can influence, that you can make an impact? If you're hoping to make a lasting impact on your child, then you're going to be the one that makes that impact. In his book, Hearts of Iron, Feet of Clay, Gary Inrig makes the observation that too often the second generation experience is a second-hand experience. He makes the statement that those in a church, statement that a parent's fervor for the Lord becomes the child's formalism and the grandchildren's apathy. Let me say that again. That the parent's fervor for the Lord becomes the child's formalism and the grandchildren's apathy. His observations were based on his study through the book of Judges and the fact that he saw that the generation that followed after Joshua, they had not seen the hand of the Lord. They had not seen the works of the Lord. They had only heard stories about it from the generation that came before them. And what happened to the generation that came after Joshua? That generation put aside the things of God and they worshiped the idols that were in the land. From fervor to formalism, from formalism to apathy. If one thing is clear, we are living in a day and age where people are apathetic towards the things of God. We're living in a day and age where lukewarmness and complacency and apathy about biblical truths rule the day. And it starts in the home if we're hoping to bring about transformation in those areas. It starts with husbands being the husbands that they've been called to be, and fathers being the fathers whom God has called them to be, and parents being faithful to model the love of Christ to their children. This underscores the importance of training our children in the Lord. If there's anything that is clear, you can see that formula, the fervor to formalism to apathy existing in our world today. As we know it, we see there's a general apathy towards the things of God. By loving God and the Lord first and having a genuine relationship with Him, fathers and mothers, it's one of those things that you can influence your child and your children's children and your children's children's children. For generations, you can have an impact with the investment that you make now. But you have to have a genuine relationship with God first. You have to have a real relationship with God first, because hypocrisy will taint your child's heart towards the things of God. That means that if they see you come to church on Sunday, on Wednesday, and then they see you out doing life in a way that's contrary to the profession of faith that you make on a Sunday morning, they will recognize that, they will see it, and they will say, one is real and one is fake. It's all an unconscious mental decision on their part. One is real and one is fake. And guess what? They're going to go with the real you, and the real you is the one that operates on a day in and day out basis, doing whatever it is that you want to do. And they may go to church with their kids, but it's a formality. And they'll live the same hypocrisy that you lived. And then their kids may not go to church at all. Why? Because they're apathetic towards the things of God. Hypocrisy is going to taint your child's heart. Be first you within a right relationship with God. So how do you do this? Well, you do it intentionally. Teach them what the Word of God says and how the Bible applies to their life, and be consistent about it. If you look in Deuteronomy 6, it lays out very clearly what the expectations are for a parent, and that we are to be teaching them in the ways of the Lord as they rise up, as they sit, as they walk, as they lay down, that we are to be teaching them these things. So it's being intentional, it's being consistent. Also, men, it's being courageous. I'm not picking on you, but I know the struggle that you face. There's some of you that are sitting in this room right now, and there's some wives that are sitting in this room right now, and they're longing for their husbands to stand up and take the role in which it is that God has called them to have within the course of their home. And the husbands are sitting there internally. They're trembling with fear. And the reason why they're trembling with fear is because they're just insecure. They're afraid of not having all the answers if the questions are asked, of not knowing where to begin. Well, guess what? Thankfully, we have this. And there are lots of resources out there to help. And guess what? Yes, you're going to fall on your face. And yes, when you try to lead your family spiritually, you're going to have a 3-year-old that while you're trying to read the Bible, he's going to lose his mind and throw a toy and hit somebody in the head with it. It's what's going to happen. Why? Because if Satan can deter you from doing your biblical mandate, he's going to. So yes, it's going to be hard. But anything worth doing is hard. Also, you're to do it honestly. If you want to lead your children well, you're to do it honestly. That means when you mess up, say you messed up. Go to your child and say, you know what, I lost my temper. That was a sin against you. That was a sin against God. Be honest with them. They're going to value that honesty versus the hypocrisy of just trying to move on and not even address it. Be honest. Let your children understand that you too need the grace of God. And that when you make a mistake that you overreact, that you go to them and you ask God for forgiveness and you ask them for forgiveness. Maybe you're sitting here today and you say, well, what steps do I need to go to next? How do I need to do this practically in my family? I want to help you. If you have questions about that, I've got resources that can help you to lead out in these areas. Things that are easy, things that are quick, but things that if you do them consistently, you can make a valuable impact on the lives of generations. If we're hoping to see restoration, reconciliation, and unity in our world, it's going to begin first in our relationship with God, and then it's going to begin carrying over in the relationships with our family, and our wives, our spouses, and our children. Let's go to the Lord in prayer.